It's 6,200 BC. You're standing in what will one day be called the Sahara. Except right now, there's no sand. There's no desert. There's grass up to your knees, lakes full of fish, and rain. So much rain that your ancestors built their entire lives around waiting for it to stop. You don't have a raincoat. You don't have an umbrella. You definitely don't have a weather app telling you there's a 90% chance of this is going to ruin everything. You just have sky, and the sky is angry, and it has been angry for weeks. This is the story of how ancient humans survived rain. Not a storm, not a bad week. We're talking about entire climate periods, centuries, sometimes millennia, where rainfall didn't just inconvenience people, it rewrote where they could live, what they could eat, and whether they'd survive the year at all. And the wildest part? Some of the evidence for how they pulled it off is written into the ground itself, into pollen, into mud, into bones buried under what is now bone-dry desert. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Humans didn't just endure endless rain. In some periods, they were built by it. Let's start with the big one. The African Humid Period. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara, yes, that Sahara, the one that currently holds the record for most aggressively a desert, was green. Lush even. Lakes the size of small seas. Hippos, crocodiles, rock art showing people swimming, herding cattle, fishing from boats. The trigger was a wobble in Earth's orbit called precession, which shifted the African monsoon belt hundreds of kilometers north. More sun on the tropics in summer meant more evaporation, more monsoon, more rain pouring into a region that today gets maybe a few millimeters a year. For thousands of years, it just didn't stop. And humans didn't just cope with this. They thrived in it, then got completely blindsided when it ended. Because that's the part of the story that usually gets skipped. Endless rain isn't actually the hard part. The hard part is what happens after. Let's talk about what endless rain actually does to a human settlement, because it's not what you'd assume. You'd think the problem is people drowning or freezing. It's rarely that dramatic. The real killer is slower and much less cinematic. Soil. Constant rain saturates the ground. Saturated ground can't absorb more water, so it starts running off instead of soaking in, and that runoff takes topsoil with it. Topsoil is where the nutrients live. Lose enough of it, and the land that fed you last season stops feeding you this one. Add prolonged damp and stored grain rots. Add rot, and you get fungal toxins. Nobody in the Neolithic had a word for, but everybody's stomach absolutely understood. So the first survival technology humans developed for endless rain wasn't shelter, it was elevation. Archaeologists have found Neolithic settlements across wet regions of Europe and Asia deliberately built on raised platforms, mounds, or stilts above the floodplain. In the wetlands of what's now Switzerland and southern Germany, entire villages from around 4000 BC were constructed on wooden piles driven into lakebeds. Not because people wanted lakeview property, but because building above the waterline was the difference between a dry granary and a rotten one. These are called pile dwellings, and they're honestly one of the more underrated feats of prehistoric engineering. You're talking about people with stone and bone tools successfully building load-bearing wooden platforms over water that survived flood cycles for generations. Some of these sites are so well preserved by the waterlogged mud that we've recovered wooden tools, textiles, even food remains. The anaerobic mud acted like a time capsule precisely because of the wet conditions that made building there necessary in the first place. History has a sense of humor sometimes. Now let's cross the planet because Europe's wetlands weren't the only place people were engineering their way around water. Along the Yangtze River in Neolithic China, around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, communities associated with the Hemudu and Liangzhu cultures were dealing with a completely different flavor of endless rain. Monsoon flooding on a scale that could reshape a river's course in a single bad season. Their answer was staggering in scope. At Liangzhu, archaeologists have uncovered one of the oldest known large-scale water management systems on Earth, a network of dams, dikes, and reservoirs built roughly 5,000 years ago to control seasonal flooding from monsoon rains and store water for the dry months in between. This wasn't a village-level fix. It was landscape-level engineering, requiring coordinated labor from thousands of people across multiple seasons, centuries before anything comparable shows up in most of the rest of the world. And it worked well enough to support one of the most sophisticated Neolithic societies we know of, complete with jade workshops, planned urban layouts, and social stratification. All of it resting on the unglamorous foundation of somebody figuring out where to put a dike. That's the pattern again. The societies that didn't just survive the rain but built civilizations on top of it were the ones that treated water management as infrastructure, not emergency response. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange. In parts of Southeast Asia and the Amazon basin, some of the earliest evidence of intentional wetland management doesn't involve avoiding the water. It involves working with it. In the Llanos de Mojos region of what's now Bolivia, archaeologists have found massive raised agricultural fields dating back over 2,000 years, built by pre-Columbian societies specifically to manage seasonal flooding. Canals channeled excess water away from raised planting beds, and that same water was funneled into fish ponds, turning the annual deluge from a threat into a food source. The rain wasn't the enemy. It was infrastructure, if you were clever enough to redirect it. That's a pattern that shows up again and again once you start looking for it. The societies that survived endless rain weren't the ones that fought it hardest. They were the ones that stopped treating it as a problem to defeat and started treating it as a variable to design around. Let's go back to shelter for a second, because endless rain creates a very specific engineering problem that dry climates simply don't have. Your roof has to shed water fast, and it has to do it forever, not just for one storm. In Neolithic Britain and Ireland, during periods of notably wet climate, roundhouses were built with steeply pitched conical roofs, thatched with reed or straw layered in overlapping courses, engineered so that water would run off before it had time to soak through. The steeper the pitch, the faster the shed, the less time for rot to set in. This wasn't guesswork. Experimental archaeologists who've reconstructed these roundhouses have found the roof angles cluster suspiciously close to the actual optimal angle for rainfall drainage, which means someone, somewhere, was doing empirical roofing science with a stick and a lot of trial and error. And when trial and error fails, people die of exposure. So the error side of that equation was not casual, it was existential. There's also the question of what people actually wore, and this is where things swerve into genuinely clever territory. In regions with sustained rainfall, parts of the Pacific Northwest for instance, indigenous peoples developed woven cedar bark capes and hats specifically engineered to shed water, using the natural water resistance of inner cedar bark fiber, stripped, softened, and woven into garments that functioned essentially as prehistoric raincoats. Some of these designs are so effective that traditional weavers still use variations of them today because, and this is the part that should humble anyone who thinks ancient people were technologically primitive, nobody has actually improved on the core idea. Cedar bark sheds water because of its natural fiber structure, not because of some later innovation. They found the right material and then just got extremely good at using it. Now let's talk about the part of this story that's darker, because prolonged rain isn't just an engineering challenge. It's a disease vector. Standing water breeds mosquitoes. Mosquitoes carry malaria. Damp conditions promote mold, fungal infection, and respiratory illness in populations that are already nutritionally stressed from failed harvests. There's substantial evidence that extended wet periods in various parts of the ancient world correlate with spikes in disease. Not coincidentally, but causally, because rain doesn't just threaten your food. It actively creates the conditions for the things that kill you once your food supply is already compromised. This is why so many ancient societies developed elaborate rain-related rituals, deities, and taboos, and it's worth taking those seriously instead of dismissing them as superstition. When your entire agricultural and survival system pivots on something as unpredictable as rainfall, building religious and social structures around it isn't irrational. It's risk management dressed up in mythology. Let's actually tour a few of these because the variety is wild. The Maya god Chak, associated with rain and lightning, wasn't worshipped because Maya farmers didn't understand agriculture. He was worshipped because Maya farmers understood agriculture extremely well and understood exactly how catastrophic it was when rainfall didn't cooperate. Elaborate rain ceremonies, sometimes involving offerings thrown into sacred sinkholes called cenotes, functioned as a kind of psychological and social technology. a way of processing collective anxiety about something completely outside human control. Across the Andes, pre-Columbian societies, including the Inca, structured entire agricultural and ceremonial calendars around Illapa, a weather deity linked to thunder, lightning, and rain, and built terraced mountainside farming systems, Andines, specifically designed to manage both drought and excess rainfall on steep terrain where a single uncontrolled downpour could wash an entire season's crop down the mountainside. In West Africa, among Yoruba tradition, Shango is associated with thunder and storms, and communities developed both ritual practice and practical water channeling around the unpredictable violence of seasonal storms. Meanwhile, in Norse mythology, storms and rain were bound up with Thor, and Scandinavian and Germanic farming communities built raised timber longhouses with steep, thatched roofs, almost identical in engineering logic to what we saw in Neolithic Britain. Different continent, different god, same steep roof math. Because water doesn't care what you believe, it only cares about the angle it's falling on. And here's the swerve. Sometimes the irrational ritual behavior had an accidental practical function anyway. Communal rain ceremonies brought entire communities together at predictable intervals, which meant information sharing, resource pooling, and social bonding exactly when people needed it most. During periods of environmental stress when cooperation was the actual survival mechanism, dressed up as religious obligation. Let's go back to the African Humid Period for the ending of this story, because it's the part that ties everything together. Around 5,000 years ago, the orbital wobble that had been pumping monsoon rain into North Africa for millennia began to reverse. The rain didn't stop overnight. It stopped over centuries, which in some ways is worse because it's slow enough that you can't fully process it's happening until the lake you fished your entire life is a marsh, and then the marsh is mud, and then the mud is sand, and your grandchildren are asking what a lake even was. The people living across the Green Sahara didn't vanish. They moved. Evidence suggests populations migrated toward the Nile Valley as the surrounding grasslands dried out. And some researchers argue this slow-motion climate collapse was a direct contributing factor to the population density that eventually helped give rise to dynastic Egyptian civilization. In other words, one of the most famous civilizations in human history may exist in part because rain stopped falling somewhere else. Sit with that for a second. The thing that looks like an ending, a lush world drying into desert, was also a beginning. The humans who survived the endless rain of the Sahara weren't just the ones who endured it while it lasted. They were the ones who could read the slow signal that it was ending and move before the ground ran out from under them completely. So how did ancient humans survive endless rain? Not with one clever trick. With an accumulated stack of small, hard-won technologies, elevate your home above the water, engineer dikes and reservoirs on a civilization-wide scale if the flooding demanded it, shed water fast off a steep roof, wear the one material nature already engineered to repel it, turn floodwater into farmland instead of fighting it, and build gods and rituals robust enough to carry the psychological weight of something you can't control. None of that required modern engineering. It required paying obsessive attention to a problem for generations and passing down what worked. And maybe that's the real thread here. We complain about a rainy weekend ruining our plans. Somewhere in our ancestry, there were people for whom rain wasn't a mood. It was a multi-generational architectural, agricultural, and spiritual project. Every time you duck under an awning, every time your roof does its one simple job of keeping water off your head, you're benefiting from thousands of years of people getting soaked, thinking hard, and building something a little better than what came before. The rain never actually stopped being a problem. We just got quietly, relentlessly good at it.